The first draft of anything you do is never good. And the old adage, it must be nice, it never starts out being nice. Anybody who's gotten to any level of accomplishment or done anything that seems worthy of doing or is admirable, usually not because they know something other people don't, they just did things most people won't, they're not willing to do. What can I bring to the table that nobody else can? And once I started focusing on that, I think that's when my niche or my brand really came about. And that process of always doing the next best thing that never ends, and it will serve you for your entire life. Title of this episode is Be an alder bush, not an oak. Nothing wrong with an oak tree, but so much. Everybody has heard the analogy, to be an oak tree, to stand alone, to be tall, to be big. There's a sense of value in oak. It's regal and respectable, a sense of sturdiness and power. Whereas an alder bush is kind of looked as maybe kind of a trash tree. They grow in swampy areas. They grow in community, they're all bunched up. And I'm using maybe like an Alaskan alder bush as kind of the primary example. I know there's a lot of different types of alders that'll grow taller. But when I look at an Alaskan alder bush, I think there's a lot of life lessons or analogies to be learned and observed. And I've spent a lot of time on wind-blown hills that are filled with alder bushes. And one thing about an alder bush is it grows where an oak tree cannot. An alder bush is, a lot of times they'll grow about 5, maybe 6 feet high, but the limbs are like 20 feet long, 15, maybe 20 feet long for a big one. And that alder bush is always real gnarly. There's, it's never straight. Because of the environment that they live in, they're constantly course correcting and hitting adversity. And then you can see where they grow. Like they'll bump into another limb of another alder bush, and then they've got to grow around one another. And I think that's a good analogy of life because it's never pretty. And if we focus on the oak tree image, I think life can be pretty daunting. Whereas if you think of approaching life, at least for me, it was more like an alder bush. The first draft of anything you do is never good. And when I look back at all the false starts that I've had, all the course corrections that I've had to make, all the times where when I thought I was going the right direction, I had to come back and go 180 degrees the other way. And that's what alders look like sometimes. You'll see them where they'll literally go down and they'll grow down and then they'll grow back up and then they go out and then they go left and then they go right. And the reality of it is if they shot straight up, they could never withstand the wind. They would get toppled over. And so as they go out and then they intermingle with their community, eventually they'll find their sweet spot where they have enough protection, and then that's where they can grow up, and then that's where they can really blossom. And so to get away from, the alder bush analogy is that basically the journey is the destination. And the old adage, it must be nice, it never starts out being nice. Anybody who's gotten to any level of accomplishment or done anything that seems worthy of doing or is admirable, the reason why it's unique and most people haven't done it is usually not because they know something other people don't. They just they did things most people won't. They're not willing to do. And one thing that I've learned myself, and then from countless hunters that I've guided and successful people that I've been around, is that you will never be ready. You've got to start wherever you're at. It starts now. No matter what, it starts now. And that never ends. You never really arrive. And if you ever get to the place of arrival, you're probably going to crash. You're probably going to get depressed. You're probably going to feel empty, and you're probably going to feel lost. And that's what I love about hunting, particularly about hunting in the Alaskan wilderness, is it's so wild, it's so vast. You are going to hit adversity, and that almost kind of becomes like a drug. That's almost kind of why you do it, is to be challenged, and that kind of makes me feel alive. Change is never comfortable. I've said it, lots of times, that in order for new life to begin, something old has to die. And so whatever you're doing, if it's business, or you're looking for a career, or working on a relationship, or want to go on some hunting adventure, it starts with a vision or a goal. But you'll virtually never get there, or it'll never go as you plan. And I think of it as, oftentimes we get to places, destinations, achieve goals, not by coming in through the front door, but rather the back door. It's oftentimes a long road, and at times you're never going straight at it, but as long as you're always kind of working, kind of like switchbacking up a mountain. You don't go straight up the hill. That just wears you out. Whereas if you just zigzag your way up, there's a reason why horse trails do that. Hiking trails, they don't just go straight up the mountain. They zigzag, switchback up the way of the mountain. I think that's kind of the way, to some degree, that you've got to approach just about anything that you're trying to accomplish. I grew up on a dairy farm. My mom and dad, on top of milking cows, they raised potatoes. We raised beef cows. We had cash crops, snap beans, peas, sweet corn. They were so diversified in the farm just to try to make ends meet. And they worked so hard, and every nickel they got, they would put back in the farm. At times they were paying like 18% interest, and it took so long, and it was such a grind. It literally took them 40 years before they ever got to a place where they weren't afraid of losing the farm, the bank foreclosing on the farm. But they stuck with it, and they never quit, and they didn't really worry about the arrival so much as they were committed. They had to do it. We had to do it to survive. And now, it literally took 40 years. Now my dad has the ability to be what I would call an executive farmer. He owns his land, and he can hire stuff out, whatever he doesn't want to do. He's 75 years old now and had a stroke a year ago, so he can't do it, but he would love to. He still loves it. And I think that's kind of lost on this generation oftentimes, is the commitment that things really truly take in our society. We see so many success stories, and maybe even like overnight success stories. And oftentimes those overnight success stories, they'll have an overnight collapse. And so the slow growth, I believe that's when I see people that have succeeded for long periods of time, it was never an overnight success. It was a slow growth to it, like that alder bush. It takes years and years and years, and they don't ever get up very high, but they're rock solid. And they form, like I said, this community and an environment around them that is stable and allows them to stand the test of time and resist the storms. My daughter Frankie, she's 11, she comes up to me, says she wants to do a vlog, a video log, I guess, and she had a GoPro that she wanted to buy. She showed me a picture of it. And I said, yeah, we could probably buy that. We could use it for the business, but if this is something you want, go use my GoPro and then do a couple vlogs with that, and then we'll talk. Well, she didn't like that. She wanted to have the latest, the newest, and the greatest. And I said, well, I've made films at least semi-professional with this old GoPro, so I believe for you starting out, it should be good enough. But she didn't show that commitment. She wouldn't go do it with my GoPro. And so I told her, I said, until you do that, I'm not seeing that you're committed, so I'm not ready to commit for you. So right or wrong, I don't believe that she's really committed to it. And if she's not committed to it, she could have all the best equipment in the world and it's not going to serve her. And why I believe I know that, or why I believe that, is when I went to Alaska, my weaknesses, my downfalls, my detriments of me going from a farm kid in Wisconsin going to Alaska as a packer and starting out learning how to become a guide, that was my biggest asset to becoming a film producer, because I was hungry, because I didn't know anything. Everything was new, and I had a fresh, virgin perspective on everything that was happening. I'd never even really camped before. All this stuff was new. And I was not filming to make a documentary, a hunting video. I was just filming home video, and I had primarily one person in mind, and that was my grandfather. And all I was trying to do was show him what the Alaskan wilderness was truly like, because he hunted and fished and trapped, and he was, he at that point he was in his late 80s, and he always wanted to go to Alaska, but he never made it. And so that was my biggest asset, was the fact that I was just trying to tell a story and show one person what hunting and the wilderness of Alaska was truly like. I had no pressure on me. I didn't have to worry about sponsors. I didn't have to worry about content, getting kill shots. There was none of that. And so I had this freedom to grow. I didn't have to pay any bills with the video. So it was always enjoyable, and I was doing it because I wanted to do it. And again, I had that freedom for many, many years, which allowed me to grow and watch it over a long period of time, for 7 or 8 years before I ever put any type of film together. And looking back, me having basic film equipment to start particularly, again, that was an asset for me. Once I started producing films, I didn't have a cameraman, I couldn't have a cameraman. And so what seemed as a detriment, that I don't have a cameraman to get all this footage, it turned out to be a blessing. And when we were putting these films together, when I tried to make my films look like, a typical hunting video, I failed, because I didn't have enough B-roll, I didn't have cinematography. And so finally I realized, well, if I'm going to try to make my product look like everybody else's, it's going to be a failure. So rather than try to be what everybody else is, what can I bring to the table that nobody else can? And once I started focusing on that, I think that's when my niche or my brand really came about, because what I could offer someone wasn't like a hunting personality that comes in and goes on, 1 or 2 sheep hunts in their lifetime. I could come from a place of a guy that's been in the wilderness for, 10, 20, 25 years, and speak from a place of experience of, 55 sheep hunts, 50 moose hunts, 60 caribou hunts, 60, 70 bear hunts. And once I realized that and focus on what I did have and really try to showcase, my story, my personality, the personality of my hunters, and was just open and raw and honest with it rather than trying to fit into any type of mold, that's where I enjoyed what I was doing. My hunters were relaxed, and I think that's when the viewers started to respond because they realized, this is something new. Like a lot of things, it's hard to recognize things at the beginning where at the end, looking back, the old adage, hindsight is 20/20. When you learn to fly an airplane, they start you off in a 150 or something that doesn't have a lot of horsepower, doesn't burn a lot of gas, it's cheap to fly. That is the best way to learn. You learn in a 150 because you've really got to fly the airplane. You've got to be a good pilot. You can't rely on the power of the airplane to get you out of situations. So that when you go to fly a Super Cub, which is kind of like a Ferrari with wings, it has tons of horsepower. You almost have to try to stall it. If you try to stall it, if you pull back on the stick, the airplane will basically just dive down and it'll start flying again. The thing wants to fly. Where a 150, you got to pay attention because it doesn't want to fly so much. It's kind of like a 16-year-old kid. You're not going to hand them the keys to a Ferrari. You're going to start on a bike, a pedal bike, a trike, a bicycle, ride a four-wheeler, a motorbike, and then somebody's going to be with them and teach them how to drive. The last thing you want is to go on a Ferrari with all that power. You touch the gas and you'll run off into the weeds, right? And when you go to flight school, one of the first things they teach you is that I think it was 80% of all airplane accidents are due to pilot error. It's not the aircraft. And so that slow growth, just learning slow and going in small increments like that alder bush. I mean, you can look at an alder bush and you can see every gnarl and twist and turn. You could tell that there is a slow growth to it. And I think that's the best way to do pretty much anything. Barry Barton, I've guided him many times. If you watch any of my hunting videos, you've seen him. An amazing guy, an amazing life story. And one of his favorite quotes is, always do the next best thing. And that's kind of a different way of saying what we're saying is, start where you're at, and just keep going. And that process of always doing the next best thing, that never ends, and it will serve you for your entire life. Proverbs 20, verse 21. An inheritance gained hastily in the beginning will not be blessed in the end. Because if people that win the lottery, how many people win the lottery and then they go bankrupt? Because if they didn't know how to take care of a little bit of money, they're not going to know how to take care of a lot of money. So again, it's that slow growth. It's the process that will ensure that whatever you have or whatever you're doing or whatever you're seeking to achieve will help you hold it in longevity. And it's human nature. We all want every advantage we can when we start. But that'll just never happen. And in that lack, that's where you'll outgrow your competition. That's where you'll get the feather in your cap that nobody else has. That's where you'll get that knowledge, that wisdom, that 10, 20 years down the line, you won't even be trying to show people or tell people, but others will see it. That it's just like this invisible threshold that you cross, like you've walked the walk, or you know what you're talking about, or you've been there and done that people can see, and there's just no shortcuts to that. So in that process, Romans 5, verses 3 and 4. Not only that, but we rejoice in our sufferings, knowing that suffering produces endurance, and endurance produces character, and character produces hope. So here we're talking in a spiritual sense, but I think that's certainly true in a spirit. It's true in every sense. Just like God's word is so true that it spreads, casts a wide net in its truth. Is in the suffering is unavoidable, but there are byproducts to the suffering, is that character, that discipline, that long suffering that will serve you through the storms. So if you're struggling, it might not be time. It's probably not time for you to go up. Like the alder bush, it's time for you're still figuring out your course, right? You're hitting adversity. Adversity is your guide. Adversity guides the alder bush. It keeps growing. It keeps going. It never quits. Nothing in nature ceases striving to maximize its potential until it dies. And eventually, once it finds that easy course, it finds that sweet spot, all of a sudden the growth, it just comes easy because, the alder bush, it naturally wants to go to the sun. It wants to go up. And we're exactly the same. Once you find that window of opportunity, you want to have done all the back work, all the suffering, got all the character, the discipline, the long suffering, learned all the lessons along the way. So when that opportunity comes and you hit that sweet spot, you grow, you go up. That's when you go vertical. So in my experience in the hunting world, guiding world, I guess, I would say it took me 20 years of switchbacking up and down the mountain, coming at it at different angles, trying to find my sweet spot, did public speaking, video production, did a TV show, guiding, hunt consulting, still doing all those things basically. But it took about 20 years of working at it, really, really working at it. And it took about 10 years, but just dreaming about it for it to really come to fruition. And I came at it through the back door. And then now, 25 years into it, so it took about 20 years before any front doors started opening to where people would call me like, hey, is this something you'd be willing to do? All of a sudden things started coming to me. And looking back, I realized that I just stuck with it long enough. It was something that I loved to do. I didn't know if I'd ever arrive, or really didn't, but I loved it. And so what I realized is that it took 20 years of sowing seeds to start seeing some real fruit, to where I could recognize that, like, holy smokes, it's finally 20 years later, it's starting to pay off. And it seems like oftentimes that 20-year threshold seems to be somewhat of a magic number for a lot of people, a lot of businesses, a lot of things. Matthew 7, verses 13 and 14. Enter by the narrow gate, for the gate is wide and the way is easy that leads to destruction, and those who enter by it are many. For the gate is narrow and the way is hard that leads to life, and those who find it are few. Again, this is in terms of salvation, but I'd say that's true of anything in life. If you want an easy life, you have to do things that are hard. If you want to do things that are easy, your life will be hard. And I think part of that process to get to that point is to not worry about being an oak, but being content being an alder bush, to recognize that, well, Scripture says that what we loose on earth will be loosed for us in heaven, and persecutions and trials and tribulations will be had in this life, that there just is no escaping it. But if we reap what we sow, the rewards will come later. So in that process, we learn to be patient in the winters. We learn to start fresh in the spring. We learn to grow in the summers. We learn to reap in the falls, but always, always be sowing seeds. Never quit, always sow seeds. And if we do that, eventually we're going to find the sweet spot. We're going to find our lane, so to speak. We're going to find our clearing where the sun is right there and there's no obstructions, and we've got those solid the root structure beneath us. We've got enough strength. We've got enough longevity. We've got a community around us because we've sown seeds, right? That one alder bush, as it sows seeds, other alders grow around it. You've got that security, you've got the protection, and you find your niche. And that's why I'm calling this Blaze Your Trail, is that God's got a unique purpose for each and every one of us. No two courses, paths, lives are the same. And we're all seeking the same destination, but everybody has to take a unique path to get there. And so if we never quit, just keep doing the next best thing, recognize that pain and starting over is part of the process. Eventually, we will find that narrow gate. We will get to the top of that mountain.